Hey family, so good to be together again. I want to invite you to join me as we read from Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 23 in week 3 of our joint series, Miracle Makers. So big shout out to our church, Freedom, Philadelphia. We love you. Love from us here, Grace Covenant Church in Washington, D.C. We've been talking about becoming a multi-ethnic people. And today we want to look at the work of the Holy Spirit in us individually, in the church collectively, and what that means reaching out beyond us. We've talked in weeks 1 about a young man named Stephen. Then we spoke last week about Philip. Today we speak about a man named Simon, also called Peter. And so follow along as I read from Acts chapter 10, beginning in verse 9. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." Peter went down and said to the men, "I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" The men replied, "We've come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say." Then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. Holy Spirit, help us. I want to highlight verse 14. In another translation, it says, "No, Lord," Peter declared, "I have never eaten anything that our Jewish laws have declared impure and unclean." This is such a significant moment. We have been looking at the work of the Holy Spirit in the life of the first century church. And the Holy Spirit is still working in the church today. And so my hope is that in reviewing some of history, we can apply it to us today. So important. There is the beginning of this relationship that Jesus has with Simon Peter. And I want to go back to where it all starts. And if you follow along in Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, it reads as follows. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Matthew 4, 18 through 22. Do you remember the beginning of your relationship with Jesus? This is the beginning of the relationship with Simon Peter. There's a struggle here. You see, the moment you begin to follow Jesus, you move, in his instance, from Simon says to Jesus says. If you're like me, you remember our childhood game. Simon says, touch your nose, and you touch your nose. Simon says, touch your ears, and you touch your ears. Sit down, but you don't sit down unless Simon says. And in this moment, the beginning of following Jesus as Lord, Simon makes a shift. It's a submission of his will to the will of God. It's intimate relationship. It's recognizing that he is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. And so there's this shift of Simon says to Jesus says. But I want you to know, the shift from Simon says to Jesus says is radical. And not only is it radical, it's also ongoing. I know the shift in me from Donnell says to Jesus says started many years ago, but the struggle continues. It's ongoing. And as we look at what it means to be a multi-ethnic people, not just in the Jewish context, but in our context, The struggle is very real. The struggle in America is real. Not only the struggle between black and white and the age-old history that entails, but the struggle for us to respond to God in that struggle. And Simon Peter has a lifelong struggle of Simon says, Jesus says, although it's progressive, it takes 1,000 moments of God interacting with him. And I believe it takes 1,000 moments of God interacting with us to bring us to a point where we actually are willing to think the unthinkable and to make possible the impossible, not by human effort, but by submission to the Holy Spirit. I've said this, and I want to say it again. One of the greatest demonstrations of the Holy Spirit's power is a people, a multi-ethnic people, actually living together in unity. It does not happen by accident. It is not fortuitous. It really takes the activity of the Holy Spirit to break the barriers in our mind, in our heart, in our culture, in the church that separates and divides people and breaks them out of their discrimination, their bias, and their prejudice, and their racism. That only the Holy Spirit can do. There's no system of man, no form of government, no ecclesiastical power on earth apart from the Holy Spirit that can break the dividing wall that exists. And God has done this by His Holy Spirit. So this struggle that we see Simon is having, it's a struggle that I have. And if you're honest, it's probably a struggle you have. It's an ongoing struggle. In this moment, Simon Peter is being asked to do the unthinkable. But he didn't get here in an instant. It's been progressive from the moment he began to follow Jesus. The moment he began to say, yes. There's always this battle between Simon says and Jesus says. You know, Simon, his resistance, his no, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean, is not without reason. There were Jewish laws in effect that prevented the Jews from eating foods that many of us, you and I, would enjoy. When that sheet was lowered, do you realize what was on it? 4-footed animals, creatures that represented nations from around the world. And when God was saying, don't call unclean what I've made clean, He was saying, I'm not just talking about food here. I'm really talking about the people, the ethnic peoples of the world. You see, the moment that He said to him, come follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people, fish for men, I'm sure there was an excitement in Simon Peter. Yes! I know how to fish for fish. Now I'm going to fish for people. When he was thinking people, he was thinking Jews. He wasn't thinking Gentiles. He certainly wasn't thinking Roman centurions. He was thinking Jews. Jesus is Jewish. I'm Jewish. The Jewish people are called by God. We're the chosen people. So if we're going to fish for anybody, it's going to be Jews. But when Jesus said fish for people, He had all nations in mind. The moment you say yes to Jesus, we don't even realize all of what's contained in our yes. And that's why there's this struggle between Simon says and Jesus says, because the yes to follow Him unfolds over time, and it brings us to places that we are brought face to face with our internal conflict, our internal biases and prejudices, and we say no, Lord, in moments that we should say yes, Lord. And I'm guilty of that. How about you? Jesus had taught him so many things. Can you imagine? You want me to eat food that's unclean? How can I do that? Well, it's not without reason. Listen, here's something that Jesus had taught earlier before this moment where he's in conflict about whether he should go see Cornelius, this Gentile. One of the moments that we find is right here in Mark chapter 7, verses 14 through 19. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. He says, are you so dull, he asked, don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. So you see the struggle. They were being challenged about, why do your disciples eat and don't perform the ceremonial hand washing? And Jesus was making the point. It's not what goes in your mouth that defiles you, because the food that goes in your mouth doesn't go to your heart. It goes in your mouth and it's eliminated as waste. It's what comes out of a man's heart that defiles him. Lying, discrimination, injustice, the things that come out of the heart, this is what defiled them, not what goes in the mouth. And so Jesus had already previously declared all foods clean. Baby back ribs, it's okay to eat it. Fried chicken, that's in the sheet. Peter is having a headache. He's so puzzled. I've never had pork. It's all good, baby. I almost imagine Jesus with a fork and knife saying, bon appetit. And this Jewish guy struggling. It's not just Simon. My wife and I had the privilege of going to Israel in February of this year, and it was an amazing moment. I love the Jewish people. I love the Jewish culture, to be able to stand in places where Jesus himself walked. During the plane ride over and back, when meals were served, the Jewish people, and there were many on our flight, they ate different than everybody else on the flight. They were served their own packaged meals, which were kosher. I sat next to some Jewish people and I watched the meal that they ate, and it was different than the one I ate. And I realized to this very day, there's still the practicing of eating things that are kosher. This is what Peter's mindset would have been. And none of the Jewish people on our plane would have dared eaten what I had. Peter's like, how could you say this? This is a conflict. And people will say, God will offend your mind to see what's in your heart. Peter, I love the ethnic peoples of the world. How about you? No, Lord, I don't love the Romans. How could I? We are people who have been oppressed for centuries by one nation after nation, all the way back during the time when Moses came and delivered us out of Egypt. And now the expectation was that Jesus was going to deliver the Jews from Roman oppression and occupation. Rome had conquered the Jews, and they were exacting taxes from them. And the Roman soldiers, the centurion, really got John the Baptist had to speak publicly about the systemic issues about the military force. I want to read a verse to you. When John was preaching and baptizing people out at the water, soldiers actually came out. And in Luke chapter 3, verse 14, it says, some soldiers were questioning him, saying, and what about us? What shall we do? And he said to them, here's what he says to the soldiers. Do not take money from anyone by force or accuse anyone falsely, and be content with your wages. I don't know what Simon Peter may have experienced personally from Rome against him, but I want you to know that he probably was an eyewitness to seeing excessive force against Jews. He knew that Rome's capital punishment regularly crucified Jews in public daylight. He'd seen them abuse or hurt Jewish people and take money from them. John had to speak against this. So how could he feel differently toward Roman? Isn't it interesting that Jesus said elsewhere in the Bible things like this? Do you want to be brothers? There's this moment in Acts chapter 21, verse 22. And it says, Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? So let alone Rome or the soldiers, he's struggling with forgiving his own Jewish brothers and sisters. How many times? Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Matthew 18, 21 through 22. In other words, I'm not counting, Peter. Neither should you. Peter's like, I'm willing to forgive, but up to a point. How many of you would want to say, Simon says versus Jesus says? Simon says 7. Jesus says 70 times 7. And he didn't mean 490. What he's saying is, listen, I've come into the world not to count men's sins against them. In fact, all the sin of humanity will be counted against me on the cross so that I can extend mercy and forgiveness to sinners who are separated from God. Now, Peter, you're following me? Live the way I do. How do I get past 7 times? I was willing, but up to a point. And Jesus says, I'm willing to the point of that it kills me to forgive you. Peter, how far are you willing to go? And if he's struggling to forgive his own brothers and sisters, how much would it be a challenge for him to do that, even with Roman soldiers? Jesus had taught elsewhere in the Bible things about this. He said that you're to love your enemies. Really, Lord? You want me to love my enemies? That's really what you want? Yeah, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. He had been taught that. Jesus says, Simon says. Jesus says, love your enemies. Simon Peter says, take them out. Do you remember them in the garden? On the night that Jesus was betrayed, Peter was willing to fight to the death. He said, even if everybody else, Simon says, I'll stand with you no matter what. Even if all fall away, not me. Jesus says, Simon, this very night, you're going to deny me 3 times. And as they stood in the garden, as they came out, the religious sect, along with soldiers, having been betrayed by one of their own, Judas, Simon takes out a sword to prove, I'm going to fight to the death. And he cuts off the ear of one of the people who's there. And then Jesus does something unthinkable. This person who's come against them, an enemy of them, Simon says, I know what to do with our enemies. He tries to kill the man, ends up cutting his ear off. Jesus takes the man's ear and heals him and restores his hearing. Peter, love your enemies. Do good to them that hate him. Simon says, Jesus says, it's an ongoing struggle. How do you forgive Rome for what they've done? How do you forgive? How do you do that? I'm struggling with just forgiving my own brothers and sisters, and you're saying I need to forgive the Romans? They don't have any part in being the chosen people. Well, do they? Here's a moment worth reading. Jesus actually commends a Roman centurion, believe it or not, in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 11. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him. This is a Roman soldier who has command over 100 soldiers. A centurion came to him, imploring him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you that many will come from east and west and will recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. This is a moment that precedes the vision of the sheep being lowered. Simon Peter would have been at this moment, so he's saying, no, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. Yet earlier, Jesus says, do you see this Roman centurion? In all of Israel, among the Jewish people, I have not found anyone with such great faith. Jesus actually marveled at the faith of this centurion. So much so, he says, listen, the man had the kind of faith that says, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but I still have faith that you, by the authority of just speaking the word, my servant will be healed. And the centurion went home, and his servant was healed. And I want you to understand what happens in that moment. Jesus makes a commendation of the Roman soldier and says this of him: men like him women like him who are outside the Jewish community from the east and the west, they're going to come and they will be at the table. They'll be dining with Abraham, dining with Isaac, dining with Jacob. Because at my table fellowship, every ethnic group is there eating. And Peter would have heard Jesus say those words, saying, men like this will be in fellowship and have table fellowship, have communion with and break bread with and eat food with and sup with people across ethnic and racial and barriers that are present today in the culture. So when Peter's saying, no, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean, Peter, don't call unclean what I've already called clean. Remember the parable I explained to you? It's not what goes in you that defiles you. It's what comes out of you. And right now what's coming out of you, and I want to get it all the way out of you, is your bias, is your prejudice, is your discrimination against Romans. What I want to get out of you is your inability to love your enemy. I need to get that out of you. Friend, it's not what's going in your mouth that's defiling you. It's what's coming out of you against another people who I love as much as I love you. He's puzzled by the vision. He's messed up by the vision. No! I'm a Jew. You know what Rome has done to us? Current day. No! I'm a black man. Do you know what white America has done to us? Ah! I don't think Jesus would change up what he would say today compared to what he said then. Donnell says, Jesus says. Put your name in the blank. Say your name. You say, Jesus says. The only issue is not who says, but who we're going to follow. Are we going to follow what we say, or are we going to follow what the Holy Spirit says? And the only way to do it, Jesus said, you can't do it. You can't do it. It's not humanly possible. We can't do it in our own strength. Holy Spirit, it takes an act of the Holy Spirit. One of the greatest demonstrations of the Holy Spirit's power is producing a people actually living together in unity, a multi-ethnic people. And he does it one person at a time. Simon, I got you where I want you. It's noon, you've fallen asleep, you're on this roof, and you're waiting for some kosher meal to be produced. And I'm going to make the most of this moment. I'm going to lower a sheet, and I'm going to do it 3 times. And it's going to have the animals representing all kinds of people groups. And here's what I say to you. Bon appetit. Bon appetit, Simon. Arise, kill and eat. Simon says, or Jesus says. You see, the struggle is ongoing. The Simon says, Jesus says, from the day he started following him to say, yeah, we're going to fish for people, not knowing that people would include Roman centurions like Cornelius. When you said yes to Jesus and that you would follow him, did you have any idea of all the people he would bring you into contact with to love? Did you ever think that he would want you to love your enemies and forgive them? Did he ever think he would want you to submit to the Holy Spirit's power and do the unthinkable? And it took 1,000 touches and points of God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit over years of Simon Peter's life to get him to this moment where she could be lowered and he could at least be puzzled and wondered, what does it mean? I want us to look at what's happening in this moment. Erna Paris, author of Long Shadows, Truth, Lies, and History, says this. Perhaps learning happens when we are startled out of our prejudice that we are barely aware of. Let me say that again. Perhaps learning happens when we are startled out of our prejudices that we are barely aware of. Peter, the sheep is startling you out of your prejudices, out of your biases that you are barely aware of. Long Shadows, her book, offers a personal examination to the shifting terrain of war and memory that seeks to understand how nations come to terms with their most painful history. Combining storytelling with observation, Paris takes the reader on a remarkable journey through the 4 continents to explore how nations reinvent themselves after cataclysmic events. She seeks out politicians and power brokers, as well as men and women living in the aftermath of repression, asking the question, who gets to decide what actually happened yesterday? than to propagate the tale? How do people live with the consequences? And why is it that many countries cannot lay the past to rest? One of the things she explores in her book is how Congressman Tony Hall, who was elected in 1978, had proposed a congressional apology that America would make to African Americans because of slavery. 2,000 people responded, and some said to Congressman Hall that he was on the right track, but they were outnumbered by those who were enraged. One man wrote in and said, I need an apology from America because of my great-grandfather who was disinvested of 435 slaves. He was called all kinds of names, etc. These are the tensions that have been at work. Some say we need to go back to slavery. It's just the tensions that are still present in our culture today. That's the reality of what Peter was living in between the Romans and the Jews. That kind of hatred. And you want me to go have a moment with a guy named Cornelius. Perhaps learning happens when we are startled out of our prejudices that we are barely aware of. This would not be the only moment that he would experience struggle with moving forward and following. There's this moment we find in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11, 14, and this is long after the moment with Cornelius. In verse 11, it says, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, who's Peter, in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? You see, the struggle is real. Simon says, Jesus says, even after the great moment with Cornelius, it goes on. But I'm so grateful for that moment with Cornelius. So grateful. In Acts chapter 8, Pastor Gabe remarked about pain and progress, and we recognize that there was a great persecution that broke out in Jerusalem. It resulted in the death of Stephen, who was a martyr for Christ. And that caused the Jews to be scattered throughout Judea, Samaria, and other regions. In fact, Simon Peter finds himself preaching the gospel throughout Samaria. This is miraculous because he's reaching out to people who are half Jew, half Gentile. He never would have done that, but the pain gave way to that, and God made the most of it. Later, he finds himself in Acts chapter 9 visiting a place called Lydda, and there's a disabled man named Aeneas. He's been paralyzed for 8 years, and by the Holy Spirit, Simon Peter speaks to him and says, Aeneas, the Lord heals you. The man stands up, fully restored, and the city begins to turn toward the Lord. Nearby, another city, Joppa, that word is spread, and they send for Simon Peter to come to Joppa. Why? Because a woman named Tabitha has died, and she was known for acts of kindness and charity, and they send 2 men who bring Simon Peter back, and when Simon arrives there in Joppa, he goes to the room upstairs where her body is there, and the widows are standing at his side, weeping, showing him and telling him the stories of all that she's done, showing the tunics she's made and the different gifts. And he asks everyone to leave, and he kneels and prays to God. And he turns to the body and says, Tabitha, arise. And she gets up. That's just amazing. Because he stays in Joppa, and now people are turning to Joppa. And that's when Cornelius, in response to a vision, has sent a soldier and 2 other servants who are Gentiles to go to Simon. And Simon's in Joppa. And when they arrive, it says they stood at the gate. They dare not go in because they know Jews don't enter the homes of Gentiles and Gentiles don't enter the homes of Jews. So they stood at the gate. But the Holy Spirit had said to him, do not hesitate to go with them. And though he was still wondering what it meant, he went downstairs and says, I'm the one you're looking for. Because they called out and said, is the one Simon who's called Peter here? And he came downstairs and said, I'm the one you're looking for. What do you want? And they tell him what happens, and he says, come in. He invites them in. This is a miraculous moment. He invites them in. And the gospel is about to spread beyond the Jewish people for the first time to the Gentile people. Because something in Peter responds to the Holy Spirit, and he moves from a Simon says moment to a Jesus says moment. And the struggle is ongoing, but that struggle with the Holy Spirit is important to address the struggle that exists between the Jews and Gentiles. And I want you to know that we're standing at the gate today in America. We're standing at the gate. And the struggle is not just a struggle between black and white. It's a struggle in the church as to whether we're going to say, we say, or Jesus says. And if by the Holy Spirit we yield to the Holy Spirit and say, what you say, not what he says, then we'll find ourselves at the gate. And it's a beautiful place to find yourself standing at the gate. You know why? Because in Isaiah it says, God is the strength of those who battle at the gate to turn back the injustice, to turn back the bias, to turn back the racism. Only the Holy Spirit can bring us to the gate if we will say, Jesus says, instead of Donnell says, instead of Simon says, until fill in the blank your name says. Holy Spirit, you've brought us to the gate. May we yield to you and say, Jesus says, and go with you and invite people into our lives that we otherwise would never, ever think possible.